My name is Thomas Reed. I am 72 years old, and I spent most of my life as a high school history teacher. My late wife's name was Margaret. She was 68 when she passed. She worked as a nurse, and for 50 years, we built a life together with love, patience, and the little traditions that make life worth living. We had one son, Daniel. He is 38 now and works in finance in a tall glass building somewhere in the city. I remember the day my life shifted, not with a bang, but with a slow, dull ache. It was a Sunday afternoon. I had invited Daniel over for lunch, roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, the way he liked when he was a boy. The table was set with the good plates Margaret had loved, and sunlight streamed through the window in that golden way that makes you pause for a moment before moving. But Daniel didn't seem to notice. He sat there scrolling on his phone, tapping away, while I tried to make small talk about the weather and the neighbor's new dog. His eyes flicked up once or twice, but there was a distance in them that made me uneasy. After the plates were cleared, he leaned back in his chair, folded his hands, and said something that would carve itself into my bones. "Dad, you can't keep living like this. You're getting older, and it's becoming a burden for me." His words didn't hit me all at once. At first, they just hovered in the air, heavy and strange. Then they sank like a stone in my chest. I asked him what he meant, and he told me he had been looking into senior homes, nice places with good care and activities that I would love. He smiled as though he was offering me a vacation, but I knew that smile. It was the same one he used when he was a teenager, trying to make me agree to something I didn't want. I told him I was fine in my home, the home I had built with his mother, the home where every corner whispered our memories. But he just sighed and said I was being stubborn, that it wasn't fair to expect him to keep checking in on me to make sure I was okay. I swallowed my pride. That day said nothing more, but when he left, the silence in the house felt louder than ever. I sat in my chair by the window, looking out at the garden Margaret had loved, and I wondered how it had come to this. My own son seeing me not as his father, but as a weight he carried. In the days that followed, Daniel's visits grew shorter, his calls less frequent. When he did call, it was to remind me of appointments or to ask if I had considered the brochures he left on my kitchen counter. Bright smiling faces of strangers in identical beige rooms. I didn't tell him how many nights I sat awake, replaying his words over and over. Burden, the word echoed in my mind until it became almost a physical thing, heavy on my chest. I began to notice other little signs, to the way he glanced at his watch when we spoke, the way he didn't ask about my health or my day, but rather about my bills, my accounts, as if I were a ledger to be balanced, rather than a man to be loved. One afternoon, as I was pruning roses in the garden, a woman stopped by. She was in her early 40s with tired eyes and hands that looked like they had known work. She introduced herself as Claire, said she had just moved into the small rental at the end of the lane. She noticed my roses and told me they were beautiful. I smiled, thanked her, and we ended up talking for almost an hour about flowers, books, and the quiet loneliness that can sneak up on a person when they least expect it. She had a daughter in college and was working 2 jobs to keep up with rent and tuition. There was something in her voice that reminded me of Margaret's steady kindness. Over the next few weeks, Claire and I would cross paths. Sometimes she'd bring me fresh bread from the bakery where she worked, or I'd send her home with a basket of vegetables from my garden. It was nothing grand, just small gestures that made the days feel a little less empty. Daniel didn't notice, or if he did, he didn't care. One evening he called and launched straight into how he had found a perfect senior facility with a waiting list, but if we acted fast, we could get me in by winter. I told him no again, firmer this time, and he grew frustrated, said I was making things harder than they needed to be, that he had a life to live and couldn't be running around after me forever. When the call ended, I sat there staring at the phone, my hands trembling not from age, but from something deeper, something close to heartbreak. I began to think about my life, about the years I had worked, saved, built a modest but comfortable home, about how Margaret and I had planned to leave it all to Daniel because we believed he would honor it. But now I saw that to him, I was not a legacy, just an inconvenience. One night I woke from a restless sleep and walked through the quiet house, touching the walls, the furniture, the photographs, as though I were saying goodbye, not because I planned to leave, but because I knew I needed to make a choice to decide who would truly value what I had built and who would simply discard it for convenience. When I looked at Daniel now, I didn't see the boy who used to run across the yard into my arms. I saw a man calculating, weighing me in terms of cost and effort, and I realized the cruel truth. He didn't want me around because he loved me. He wanted me gone because it would make his life easier. And that was the night I decided my will would change, and with it so would everything. The next morning I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee growing cold between my hands and stared at the folder where I kept all my important papers, my will, the deed to the house, the accounts, Margaret, and I had worked a lifetime to fill. I thought about calling my lawyer right then, but I wanted to be sure I wasn't acting out of anger. So, instead, I went for a walk down the lane. The air was crisp with the first hints of autumn, and leaves crunched under my shoes. Halfway to the corner I saw Claire outside hanging laundry. She waved, and I wandered over. She asked if I was all right, and without meaning to, I told her about Daniel, not every detail, but enough for her to understand that my own son thought of me as a burden. She didn't pity me or tell me I was overreacting. She just listened and said quietly, sometimes family isn't about blood, it's about who shows up for you when you need them. I didn't know then how much those words would stay with me over the next few weeks. Daniel's visits became even more mechanical. He would stop by, glance at the pantry, comment on how I should be careful not to climb ladders or carry heavy boxes, and then leave after 20 minutes. Once he even brought a real estate flyer for a smaller condo he said could be mine after I sold the house, as though the thought of me in this home was simply an inconvenience to be solved. I began meeting with my lawyer, Mr. Harris, an old friend who had known Margaret and me since our first mortgage. He raised an eyebrow when I told him I wanted to make significant changes to my will, but he didn't question my reasons. I told him I wanted to leave the house, my savings, and the little cabin by the lake, not to Daniel, but to someone who would truly appreciate them. I didn't tell him the name right away, but in my mind I already knew Claire had never asked me for anything, never hinted at wanting more than the occasional loaf of bread or basket of tomatoes. She worked herself weary to pay for her daughter's education and still found time to stop by and check on me or bring soup. When she noticed I had a cold one chilly afternoon, she came over with a thermos of chicken noodle and sat with me by the fire. We talked about her daughter Emily and how proud she was of her grades and part-time job. I saw in her eyes the same fierce love I had once felt for Daniel, and it struck me how different their values had become. I began quietly sorting through my belongings, keeping aside things Margaret had loved, setting them in boxes labeled for donation and others for keeping. Each item held a memory, some sweet, some bittersweet. One evening Daniel called again, his voice tight. He said he had found another place, cheaper this time, with a shuttle service to the mall and medical appointments. He spoke like a salesman trying to close a deal. I told him firmly that I wasn't moving, and he snapped, saying I was making things hard for him, that he had his own life to manage and couldn't keep worrying about me. I wanted to tell him he didn't have to worry because I was fine, that the truth was he didn't visit out of love but obligation. But I didn't say it, I just listened as his voice grew colder than the line went dead in the days. After that call, I threw myself into making arrangements. I called Mr. Harris and told him the full plan. My assets would go to Claire, with a small trust for Emily's education, the cabin, the house, the savings, all of it. I could imagine the look on Daniel's face when he found out, but this wasn't about spite, not entirely. It was about making sure the life I had built went to someone who cared, someone who would see it as more than numbers in an account or property to unload for cash. One Sunday, I invited Claire and Emily over for dinner. Roast chicken, mashed potatoes, like the ones I used to make for Daniel when he was young. Emily reminded me of him in the way she laughed, but there was a light in her eyes that is no longer had. After dinner, Claire helped me with the dishes, and I finally told her my plan. She froze at first, insisting she couldn't accept something so large, but I told her it was my choice, my gift for the kindness she had shown without asking for anything in return. Her eyes filled with tears, and she gripped my hand, saying she didn't know how to thank me. I told her she already had, just by being there. Daniel didn't call for almost 3 weeks after that. When he did, it was to tell me he had been busy and ask if I had looked at the latest brochure he mailed. I told him no, and he sighed like a man dealing with a stubborn child. He asked if I had thought about what would happen to the house after I was gone, and for a moment I almost laughed. The irony was bitter. I told him not to worry about that it was taken care of. He seemed relieved, probably imagining that meant he would inherit it. He had no idea how wrong he was. In the meantime, Claire began stopping by more often, sometimes to share a cup of tea, sometimes just to sit in the garden and watch the sun dip behind the trees. I felt lighter around her, less like a burden and more like a friend, and I realized that the ache in my chest from Daniel's words was beginning to fade, replaced by a quiet resolve to see this through. I knew the day would come when he would find out, and it would hurt him, but perhaps that hurt would be the lesson he needed, though I suspected he might never truly understand. By the end of that month, my new will was signed and sealed. Mr. Harris told me to keep it in a safe place, and I did, locking it away in the desk drawer Margaret and I had bought together 50 years ago. I sat there a long time after he left, running my hand over the worn wood, thinking about all the years that had led to this moment. My heart was steady, no longer uncertain, no longer aching, just ready for whatever would come next. It was early winter when Daniel finally showed up again, snow clinging to his coat and an impatient look in his eyes. I was in the living room trimming the small tree I put up every year, a tradition Margaret had loved. He didn't bother with pleasantries, just brushed the snow from his sleeves and asked me to sit down. He had something important to discuss. His voice carried that careful tone people use when they think they're being reasonable but are really cornering you. He said he had been looking at my finances to help me prepare for the future. His friend from work had recommended a financial advisor who could liquidate the house quickly and get me into a safe facility. By spring, I listened silently as he laid out the numbers, like I was some project planned to be executed. The words rolled over me without sticking, because I already knew the ending to this story. When he finally stopped to take a breath, I told him calmly that I appreciated his concern, but I had already taken care of everything regarding my future and the house. He blinked, surprised, then his brow furrowed. What do you mean taken care of? I told him I had rewritten my will last month, and all my affairs were in order. I could see him doing the math in his head, the momentary flicker of greed that always betrayed his true interest. He asked if that meant he didn't have to worry about selling the house, and I smiled. No, Daniel, you won't have to worry about the house at all, because it's not going to you. The silence between us grew sharp and heavy. He stared at me like I had spoken in another language. What do you mean not going to me? I met his eyes and told him plainly, the house, the cabin, the savings, they're going to Claire and her daughter Emily, his face drained of color, then flushed red. He laughed in disbelief, thinking it was some kind of cruel joke. But I didn't waver. I explained that Claire had been here for me in ways he hadn't, not because she had to, but because she cared. She had given me kindness without expectation. And in my book that was worth more than blood, he started pacing, muttering about betrayal, about how I was being manipulated, how Claire was probably taking advantage of me. I let him rant until he finally stopped long enough to meet my gaze. And I told him that the only person who had taken advantage was him. He had treated me like a problem to be solved, not a father to be loved, and he had done it so often that I had stopped expecting anything else. He fell silent then, and for a moment I thought I saw a flicker of shame in his eyes, but it vanished as quickly as it came, replaced by cold resentment. He told me I'd regret this, that when I was gone people would think I'd lost my mind. I simply told him they could think what they liked. The truth was between me and the people who had earned my trust. Daniel left without saying goodbye, the sound of the door slamming echoing through the quiet house. I stood there for a while, staring at the tree, its lights glowing, soft and steady the same way they had every year. That night, Claire stopped by with Emily, bringing a tin of cookies they'd baked. I told them what had happened, and Claire's eyes filled with worry, but I waved it off, telling her it was done, and I felt lighter for it. Emily hugged me before they left, whispering, "Thank you, Mr. Lewis," in a voice so sincere it almost broke me. Over the next few months, Daniel's calls grew less frequent, until they stopped altogether. He didn't come for my birthday. He didn't send a card. In truth, I had expected this, but what I hadn't expected was how little it hurt. Life became quieter, but not lonelier. Claire and Emily filled the gaps with visits, laughter, and small acts of kindness. Spring arrived with gentle rains and blooming lilacs, and I found myself sitting on the porch most afternoons, watching the world soften around me. One morning, Mr. Harris stopped by with papers for me to sign, just minor updates, but it reminded me that everything was truly in place. We drank coffee in the kitchen, and he told me plainly that in all his years he'd rarely seen someone so at peace with their decisions. I told him it was because I knew I'd done the right thing. A year later, on a bright summer day, Emily graduated from university. Claire invited me to the ceremony. I sat in the audience, feeling a swell of pride as she walked across the stage, her cap tilted slightly and her smile wide. Afterward, she found me in the crowd and pressed a bouquet of wildflowers into my hands, saying she couldn't have done it without me. In that moment, I knew that Margaret would have approved of everything I'd done. Months later, I heard through a neighbor that Daniel had tried to sell his own house, but had run into financial trouble. He never came to me for help, and I never reached out to offer, not out of cruelty, but because I had finally understood something important. You cannot force love or loyalty from someone who sees you only as a resource. The night before Christmas that year, I sat in the living room with the tree lit and a fire crackling. Claire and Emily came over carrying a pie and gifts. They stayed late, talking, laughing, until the clock struck midnight. When they left, Emily hugged me tightly, and Claire whispered, "Thank you again for everything." I watched them walk down the snowy path to their car, my heart full, not of revenge, not anymore, but of peace. Daniel would tell whatever story he wanted about me after I was gone, but I knew the truth. I had chosen to give the best of what I had left to the people who had given me the best of themselves, and that was a choice I would never regret.